Good morning, everyone. We're going to be starting promptly at 9 o'clock, so in 2 minutes. All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our React for Change Part 2, a guide to crafting anti-racism, anti-racism statements. We're going to move along here. Hey. So hello, everyone. Again, good morning. My name is Mariana Serrano. I'm the Chief Inclusion and Belonging Officer for Thought Partner Solutions, as well as the Program Manager for Minority Inclusion Project. Getting into a little bit about us, we here at TPS, we are a minority-owned group of passionate consultants, trainers, and facilitators who specialize in helping business leaders to develop effective and responsive ideas, meaning inclusion, diversity, equity, and access solutions. About a little bit about MIP, we exist to close nonprofit racial leadership gap by developing pathways to leadership for people of color while helping community organizations become structurally and systemically diverse and equitable as well as inclusive. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker, but before that, we wanna just dive into what we value. We value radical open-mindedness, building trust by exhibiting vulnerability. We here at TPS and MIP speak our truth and our full truth, showing compassion and inclusiveness while we're doing that. We also like calling out problems while calling in people. We always want to challenge systems and not put so much strain on individuals. We also understand and realize that we don't know what we don't know, but when we do know what we know, we have to hold ourselves accountable. We also like to embrace failure, right? Because we're not perfect, we are humans. We also like to learn and grow and do some self-development. So here we do read a lot of books and challenge ourselves individually and collectively. So we're gonna move along here. So I do have the pleasure of introducing the speaker here, Jamal Jimerson. He is an amazing colleague, friend, leader, who is truly an inspiration, also known as, we all know him as a catalyst. He has such a big heart and also has so much influence in our community. So a little bit about Jamal. Jamal is the Chief Inclusion Equity Officer for Thought Partner Solutions. He is also an independent management strategy and business development consultant, specializing in the nonprofit service sector for over 20 years. Jamal is qualified in understanding and leveraging communication excellence to help leaders achieve organizational goals with a specific focus of racial and ethnic diversity, equity, and inclusion. He has a Master's of Science degree in Human Services with a concentration in the management of nonprofit agencies, and a Master of Arts degree in Business Communications with a concentration in leadership and influence, as well as a bachelor degree in mass communication, where he has concentrated on understanding the roles of communication and fostering interaction and interdependence across gender, race, and culture. Jamal started his career in youth and program development for public and charter schools. He then transitioned into advancing diversity efforts by recruiting Black and Latino students for high-profile independent schools in New York and Connecticut. He began his facilitation and training experience with adult ex-offenders, teaching workshops in entrepreneurialism, life skills, job development through a social service organization. His training and experience was developed while facilitating workshops for middle and high school educators and administrators, teaching them how to advance a college going culture in their schools. Jamal then moved into senior executive leadership roles in nonprofit sectors, managing statewide anti-poverty and social justice programs. In 2015, Jamal founded and established a nonprofit organization, Minority Inclusion Project, also known as MIP, to help the nonprofit racial leadership gap through development and implementation of board diversity and inclusive. In 2016, Jamal established Thought Partner Solutions, a minority-owned led firm that provides keynote speaking engagements, training, facilitation, and consultancy service for businesses, educational institutions, municipalities, and nonprofits. As a highly sought speaker and trainer, Jamal has given many presentations and keynotes on racial equity, diversity, and inclusive leadership for workshops, regional and national conferences, nonprofits, colleges, businesses that combines research, personal stories, and his professional experience. Jamal is a proud father of two children, Layla Nicole and Malcolm Jamal, whom he credits as his personal board of directors. He has been a DJ, a spoken word artist, a voice of both commercial and non-commercial radio programs. Jamal, in my own personal experience with Jamal, he has been such an amazing friend. And if you ever get to truly meet him in person, I mean, just ask him about like his cucumber salads and his great chef abilities. He is truly a bright soul, a great spirit to be a part of. So please join me in welcoming Jamal to the mic.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Wow, and it is a good morning. And I'm happy to be here. Thank you for that introduction, Mariana. And once again, shouting out my cucumber salad for those of y'all who appreciate a good cucumber salad. One day we got to have one together. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. It's we have a lot to cover today in part 2 of our React for Change work. The guide to crafting anti-racism statements. We're going to cover a lot in our session today. I just want to quickly acknowledge, I know some of you have mentioned in the chat that you've been having some challenges with your audio. Most folks seem to be okay with audio. So that usually tells us that there's something on your individual computer that you may need to adjust. So check your audio settings to ensure that you are receiving sound. Make sure your speakers are turned up. This is not a traditional Zoom meeting in that there are no breakout rooms. There's not going to be a lot of interaction in that sense. You're going to be really sitting through the session, really taking in information. I would encourage you to have your notebooks out, take good notes, process this information as you're hearing it, really try to be present in this moment to take in as much as you can. One of the things we are really trying to get people to understand, particularly white allies, is how to not be an expert in the room. So we want you to learn how to just kind of sometimes listen and learn from folks that are different from you, who have different experiences, process what you're hearing, be present in that work, and really take in as much as you can. We've got 90 minutes together this morning, y'all. We'll be together from now until about 10:30. We are going to try to build in an opportunity for some Q&A at some point later in the session. Someone mentioned in the chat earlier something about seeing us. Let me just be clear. We are here to present you with great information. We will, at the end of the video, we'll make sure that we go live for a brief moment, just to say our goodbyes. But this is really not about us. It's not about censoring us. It's about trying to center this work and ensure that that folks have what they need to be able to move this conversation forward. Let me say this also. What inspired this was an authentic desire to really see us do more and do better, with addressing anti-racism in a meaningful way. And so when I tell you that this was, Mariana and I literally had a conversation, as the protest started to kind of elevate around George Floyd. And then I sat up one night and started writing an article, and to address specifically the statement issue, because I got a lot of inbox requests for people saying, hey, can you look at my statement, or can you help us craft a statement? And I was like, I'm not going to sit with each organization and do a statement. I'm going to craft something that can be used as a guide point so that folks can use that to evaluate the integrity of their statements. And so I put that together, and then I realized it was something that, it'd be great if we could offer that to, a large number of folks at one time and just give you this information. Not everything that we do is meant to be free, and it won't be free. But these particular workshops particularly are designed to give you frameworks, to give you thoughts, to provoke your thinking, but to invite you into the complexity of this work so that you can realize that it's not necessarily supposed to be easy. Before I begin, I just want to do a quick poll. So I want to just know who's in the room, just, who we dealing with. We mentioned that we're looking, and you can multiple choice this. This doesn't necessarily knock you into one category alone, but I need to know identity wise where I'm at. So I'm looking at the results come in. I've got 105 people, 107 people in this room right now. We had about 200 that registered. So we just want to give it a few minutes to kind of see if you could take a moment to respond. We'll give it another 20 seconds or so. All right. So thank you for participating in the poll. I appreciate that. We have a sense now of who's in the room, which is really good. It appears that we have a number of people that are identifying as white allies. Second to that are staff or volunteer in a white-led organization, which is good for us to know in terms of the people who are in the room. There was also a question that came up in chat about sharing the slides. No, we're not going to share the individual slides. Again, our approach to this is not to just give out IP. If you're here at the webinar, you're here. We will share the recording of the webinar, but we're not going to send out the individual decks. That's not something that we do broadly to the public. We do that for our clients. We do that for folks that we are contracted to do work with. But because this is our IP, we want to make sure we keep that. However, we are sending out the videos of the webinars. That will go out, and you're welcome to share that with the public and do as you choose to do. So let's jump right in to the good stuff here. And I want to begin by just framing the why. This is very important as a grounding point for why we are here today, right? And why I'm here. And so when Mariana introduced me, she talked about, like the authenticity in my work. And we often talk, her and I, behind the scenes about how difficult this work really is, how difficult it is. This week I'm literally, we both are, for 4 straight days, we're going to be in constant conversations with different groups about racism, anti-racism, racial equity, racial justice, and racial healing. Y'all, we are Black people, and we are living this reality and have been doing so for a long time. So it is taxing. So oftentimes we have to ground ourselves back in the cause. What brought us here? Why are we here? And there's a few things. Number one is that I've learned over the course of my life and my career to really see people as truly being creative, resourceful, and whole. And so that's the way I look at individuals, and I see their humanity in that context. But because I see you as creative, resourceful, and whole, I don't think I'm here to do anything for you. I think I'm here to support you in being able to find answers that are probably within yourself. I don't consider myself to be an expert on diversity, equity, or inclusion. I consider myself to be a thought leader. I'm someone that's on the journey with you. I may be at a different point in the journey, but I'm on that journey. But because the work is constantly evolving and changing, I'm evolving and changing with it. I wish there was more that I knew, and I'm trying to learn as I go. And I think that's the idea, is that we all need to embrace the humility of the moment that we're in life and just continue to learn. So along those lines, I believe, because I believe everyone is creative, resourceful, and whole, I feel like professionally, I have three things that I'm here to do. And one is to advance Black leadership in the social sector. I'm getting right to the core of it. I need to see people of color, and particularly Black people, positioned in leadership in the nonprofit sector, a sector that I care a lot about. And so much of that is rooted in the fact that I know that nonprofits do tremendously valuable work in primarily communities of color and working with communities of color. And many of those nonprofits, even in spaces that are considered to be majority minority, in other words, spaces that are heavily populated by Black and brown people and other people of color, those nonprofits still don't have representative leadership. They still don't have boards and leadership that reflects and accurately represents their community. And so, frankly put, I exist to advance Black leadership as a Black person in the social sector. The second piece is, when it comes to cultural competence and proficiency, I exist to support white allies. I exist to support the 62% of folks who responded and said, I'm an ally. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in this conversation around the statement. But I want you to be competent, and I want you to be proficient, which is the ability to take what you know and apply it in a meaningful way. And I want to help you with that. And I also want to be a part of dismantling and destroying white supremacy as it exists and shows up within institutions and within our structures. I don't think that we can do it all. And I had a great conversation with a good friend of mine about the idea of macro versus micro, and this idea of how important it is for us to understand the macro, but to work within the micro. So the concept here is that you understand the larger, nuanced, complex, systemic inequities. You understand systemic racism. You understand the systemic and institutionalized problems and barriers and racism that exist. But the overwhelm that sometimes comes in the sense of urgency that comes with it is that you want to tackle everything at once and you want to fix it all. And so every time a new situation arises, there's new racialized violence, we want to react. We want to react in the moment by fixing everything. But these problems did not begin overnight, and they won't be solved overnight. And that doesn't mean that we can't have a sense of urgency to resolve them. But what that means is that we need to be realistic about what we can accomplish within the scope of our life and within the locus of control that we have as individual actors in a very complex system. The system is very complex. So I encourage you to not only know your why, but to translate that into your what. And for me, I recognize the why at the macro level, but at the micro level, my what is consulting. My what is teaching. My what is training, coaching, challenging not only others, but myself, inspiring, which I know that I can motivate people, I can get them charged up, but I want to give them the agency, the power, the sense of their own creativeness and resourcefulness and wholeness to do this work without me. Yes, I want to be able to have an influence on spaces and not be in the room at the time that I'm influencing them. I want to help folks to create a vision. I'm a visionary. I believe in painting pictures and going after big things. And if I can show you how to do that, then I want to do that. And I also want to help you by connecting the dots between the different information that you're knowing, by understanding and getting a well-rounded perspective on all these things that are going on, but also connecting in a human form. Relationships matter. And so relationships are very important to me. And they're very important to me for a lot of reasons. Spiritually, there are a lot of reasons in terms of my professional journey, a lot of reasons in terms of my personal journey, but I want to encourage you to think about the integrity and the depth of your relationships, because sometimes the work that we want to do is really predicated upon our ability to build meaningful relationships at the micro level, life-changing, awe-inspiring, game-changing, community-lifting relationships. When we hear people talk all the time about how they don't have a certain network, or they don't know certain people, or they can't achieve diversity because they don't know certain people, they live in a certain community, they don't know, like, I'm like, that's all a cop out. It's a cop out. You need to build relationships, and it goes back to when we were in grade school. You know, I'm not telling you it's easy to build relationships, but you've got to put yourself outside of your comfort zone, meet people who are different, and get to know them. And white folk, that means you have to come outside of the cushy coziness of the white neighborhoods that you live in, where we are not necessarily allowed to birdwatch, and come outside of those neighborhoods and be available and accessible and engaging with Black people. We exist on the other side. Come talk to us. And talk to the Black people in your neighborhood too, because we exist in those neighborhoods as well. But come outside of those spaces and talk. And when you talk, I want to encourage something that I really believe in, which is what I call straight talk for straight understanding. Straight talk for straight understanding. That means be direct, be honest, be truthful. And so all of this feeds the way that you talk about these issues, and you embrace these issues, and you manifest your understanding of that in the statements that you make, not just the verbal statements, but the nonverbal statements that you make. And as someone with a background in communication, I'm going to tell you straight up that your nonverbal communication is what is really going to tell the story. It's what you do that gives a bigger statement than what you say. But ultimately, whether you're doing it or saying it, it needs to be underwritten by this idea of straight talk for straight understanding. And then the other piece that's really important is recognizing the humanity of people, the room and the capacity for people to be wrong, to make mistakes, to have an oops moment. I recognize that in everyone, including well-intentioned, well-meaning, liberal white folk. Okay, the people that I come across on a regular basis, people who are at the sidelines, at the front lines, in the middle of the pack, who say, Jamal, I want to make a difference. People I call friends, okay, make mistakes every day. And we have to challenge each other, but also recognize our humanity in that process. Who are we at the core? Why do we think the way we do? What are the areas where we can grow? Don't expect ourselves to be perfect in anything that we do. Embrace the idea of failure, because failure is a part of how we grow. There's not a single thing that exists that hasn't failed in its creation initially. It has to fail in order to evolve. So in order to reconcile racial division, in order to create a more equitable and just racial system, you're going to have to embrace the fact that there have been hundreds of years of deliberate actions that have resulted in the failure of systems. This is a blackout. And when there's a blackout, we have an opportunity to fix the problem and get the lights on for everyone. But part of doing that is recognizing that we all have a role in fixing the system, that we are human beings who make mistakes, and we are human beings that have inherited a janky system, and we've got to fix it. So I want to just say that that's my why. But in this particular webinar, we need to think about why you're here. And I'm going to just throw this question out. Are you here for window dressing? Are you here because it looks good? Are you here because you just realize that Black people in this country are being oppressed? Are you here because now all of the CEOs and the presidents and everyone else of these big corporations are finally acknowledging the lived experience of Black people? Or are you here because you are authentically in solidarity with Black people and marginalized people and oppressed people of any identity? What is your why? And this is not for the adult tapes. This is not for me to have you raise your hand or jump in the chat box or make a public statement in this particular moment, but I need you in your space, in the moment that you're in right now, to authentically ask yourself, why the hell am I here? Is it because I'm suddenly outraged? Is it because I'm confused? Am I doing this because it looks good for my job? Have I been forced to be here? You need to ask yourself that question and come to grips with why you're here. But I would tell you that the idea of this particular conversation and where you will be transformed through this particular conversation is if you are here in authentic solidarity with Black people, marginalized people, and oppressed people of any identity. If you truly want to embrace anti-racism, which is the deconstruction of white supremacy, and do that in your moments and every opportunity that you get, then you're in the right place. This workshop is a how-to for white allies. It's a how-to for white accomplices, co-conspirators, friends of the movement, anti-racism activists. That's who this workshop is for. And if you're not that person, if all you're here, if you're just the communications person at your job who's trying to figure out how do I put a couple words together to make it sound like we are on point with Black people, respectfully, I ask for you to step out. That's a different type of workshop. You got to go to a PR firm for that. I'm not a PR firm. I'm a consultant that lives with my heart on my sleeve, trying to change the world around me. I told you I'm in purpose. And I'm taking those who want to be on this journey with me on the journey. And this is consistent. I've been this way for 20 plus years. That's never changed. So if you're one of these people who really wants to be about change, let's go. Let's get it. Let's make these changes. In part one of our series, we talked about this model that we created called the REACT model. And it's such an interesting thing. I'm a spoken word artist, and I love to play on words. I love to use words in such an interesting way, right? But when you hear react and then you hear me telling you don't react, respond, pay attention, because those two concepts kind of play against each other. But fundamentally, react worked because of the acronym of racial equity, acknowledgement, commitment, and transformation. And fundamentally, when we say racial equity, we're talking about getting to a point where your outcomes are no longer determined by your race. But to get there, to achieve racial equity, you've got to do some things that are very difficult. And the first of which is what we call acknowledgement. And it's acknowledging not just the manifestation of racism. Racism is not an act. It's not an event. It doesn't just happen one time. It's not one cell phone video. It's not one situation that's happened. It's the manifestation of a lot of different things that have been rooted deep into the fabric, woven into the fabric of this country. And the acknowledgement of that is important. The acknowledgement, the listening, the learning from the lived experiences of those who've been marginalized and oppressed, particularly Black people in this country, is a significant part of being able to move forward and move toward racial equity. And racial justice and racial equity are different, because racial justice says you're not just going to acknowledge racism, you've got to atone for it. Justice is about balance. So that means there's some things you're going to have to do deliberately within the context of your organizational systems and your communities to atone for the racism that has been inflicted on, that has been designed and inflicted on primarily Black people in this country. And that takes a commitment. And you'll notice that stop sign kind of thing around commitment is like, yeah, you stop at that point to plan, to really deep down ask yourself, can I commit? Am I committed? Will I commit personally and professionally and spiritually and financially and emotionally and psychologically? Can I give my whole self to committing to this? Because that's what's going to drive change. And that's what's going to lead to transformation, not transaction. This is not a training, folks. This is not a training. A training is transactional. What this is right now that we're doing for you, what we're talking to you about is transformation. We're not talking about a surface level optical shift. We're talking about a deeper core shift in who you are and who you are as it pertains to community and who you are as it pertains to power, and shifting that from the inside out. So I know that folks are like, yeah, cultural competency, diversity, equity, and diversity. I'm not there right now. I'm talking about something that's not about a transaction. I'm talking about changing the way you live your life. I'm talking about changing the way we live our lives so that we can be more humane and we can pay attention to the lived experiences of those who are outside of us, that we will get out of the bubble of our own unconscious incompetence. We rest in a bubble and we think the whole world is that bubble, and it's so much more. And so people who are oppressed in any situation are living a totally different experience. But as it pertains to race, racialized people, oppressed people, people of color, Black people in particular, natives in particular, have been living a very different experience in this country. And acknowledging that is not a surface acknowledgement. It means you got to go deep. It's not one book or two. It's not one video or another. It's not I acknowledged it today and I'm going to fix it tomorrow. It's an ongoing agenda towards acknowledgement, commitment, and literally transforming yourself and your life.
I want to bring you something we've been working on today as we looked over everything that's been happening across our country over this past weekend. Sometimes there's so many different images, it can be hard to understand what's really happening. So I want to go into the fundamentals of this moment, and I hope you stay with me. So I'm going to try to do a few things here, from looking at the latest on the ground to looking at the seeds of these issues in history in this report. Now, there's no single image or clip or quote that can capture everything going down right now, but we can begin with scenes from this weekend that depict the turmoil that's permeating our whole nation right now and some of the emerging voices that could define this moment. Please keep in mind as I show you this next clip, this series of clips really, that some of what you're about to see can indeed be disturbing.
I watched a white officer assassinate a Black man, and I know that tore your heart out.
Charge the cops. Charge all the cops.
Oh, no, 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 no. I share the outrage, and I stand with the protesters.
Charge them in every city across America where our people are being murdered.
We see several officers go up to the car and start breaking the glass.
Now is the time to plot, plan, strategize, organize, and mobilize.
Mobilize. We want you to know as we report the facts here, altogether, we've seen that mobilization, protests in at least 140 cities, continuing right now tonight as the president prepares to speak. Now, many of these are primarily peaceful in nature. Some turned to looting and violence. Authorities have made over 4,000 arrests to date, and this is not over. Officials also counting several people who've died in these protests. Now, in a movement confronting police misconduct, also these allegations of misconduct in the protests themselves. A video that has circulated of officers escalating and initiating contact. This footage of NYPD appearing to make a decision to drive into a crowd of civilians. That's now under investigation. So as this all piles up, many are asking right now, how did we get here? The short answer is as depressing as it is enraging. We have been here in this position for a long time. When a society is fundamentally unjust, its injustices build and fortify themselves over time. New developments that occur can routinely then flow into the existing systems. So take these three flashpoints right now: the police, the economy, and the pandemic. Well, the first two operate on years of inequality. The third, this coronavirus, of course, arrived as a new phenomenon, but it swiftly ground its way through old inequalities: American housing, healthcare, and economics, all unequal. And that swiftly turned this technically blind virus into a discriminating killer. Black Americans dying at roughly triple the rate of white Americans right now from it. The economy reinforcing the dynamic. We can all see that tens of millions of jobs were just eliminated from the virus shutdown. It's obviously not the workers' fault. So I ask you tonight, can we also see that Black workers are almost twice as likely to be laid off during the pandemic? And while, yes, everyone may be feeling the recession in different ways, I ask you tonight to look at this. Can we also see that while 17% of white-owned businesses face a decline in this pandemic, the number is more than double that for Black-owned businesses? And months into this, I have another question. Can we also see that Congress has taken your money for pandemic relief, and while some of it did go to health care and unemployment insurance, a significant majority of the $454 billion in relief bills have benefited large corporations with these huge payoffs with very little accountability. And the 1% is profiting right now as people go hungry and march tonight billionaires have grown $434 billion richer in the pandemic. Hundreds of billions. So as we try to understand all this as it keeps going, protesters know about these facts I'm telling you. You know about these facts. People know where the money goes. People know how the powerful reward themselves and control capital. And as we have a larger debate about a reopening staffed by essential workers, who of course do essential labor, can we address the fact that they find their treatment by corporations and the government to be anything but essential? And that's why this is also a night to study and listen to people who've been pressing these injustices long before they took over the headlines or shut down our streets.
If you can only be tall because somebody's on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And my feeling is white people have a very, very serious problem. And they should start thinking about what they can do about it. Take me out of it.
Toni Morrison speaking to America's foundations. Or take the author James Baldwin, who urged American society, white and black, to really face the violence that creates these scenarios where America's racist roots are fortified by modern law and policing. Baldwin arguing, you must understand that to see violence in its proper context, be it police brutality or violence by the state or the murders that ended the lives of a generation of leaders, from King to Malcolm X to Medgar Evers to Fred Hampton.
We are still governed by the slave codes. What is called the civil rights movement was really insurrection. So one can say that the latest slave rebellion was brutally put down. We all know what happened to Malcolm. We all know what happened to Martin. We know what happened to Fred Hampton and Mark Clark. And so many more.
That's a little bit of the history as we watch more history unfold tonight. And this admittedly incomplete report has thus far briefly touched on the economy and the pandemic. Now, as for the police conduct that did set off these wider protests, well, that history's been with us a long time. The repeated use of excessive force and killing, which begins as incidents, but then worse, becomes formally legitimized in a U.S. criminal justice system that allows and defends it. Now, we can report that to you tonight as a fact, because the facts show a vast majority of the allegations against police in these instances result in no firings, let alone criminal charges. In the few cases that do lead to a charge, take roughly 15 per year over 10 years. It's about 10 per year of charges of manslaughter or higher. And the convictions for those very rare charges, I can tell you, are even more rare. There's a Bowling Green professor, Philip Stinson. He tracks all on-duty incidents that result in a death with policing. And he found over several years there were literally zero such convictions in the whole country. If you widen out to a 15-year period of time that he used in his studies, 5 officers in deadly on-duty shootings were convicted of murder. The reason why that's all lopsided on the far right of your screen, and this is so vital to what's happening in America right now, is that 4 of those 5 were convictions from after 2016. So what little change we've seen came after the Black Lives Matter movement and after the spike in cell phone video recordings. Another way to say it, the killing continues. It was rarely ever caught or punished, and the handful of changes I just showed you, they have come at the margins when there is a combination of an extremely incriminating video and public pressure and often, yes, people in the streets. So while no law-abiding citizen is going to support crime or violence, when we stop and listen to the history and listen to those who risk their lives for social change while also advocating peaceful methods for change, tonight, as we look over everything that's happening, I want to tell you it is worth listening to how even they put riots in the context of injustice.
I will continue to condemn riots and continue to say to my brothers and sisters that this is not the way. In the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard.
The unheard. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking about the other America. Can we hear any better? Can we listen any better? That was over 50 years ago. It is a problem that so many of these observations ring so true, so insightfully, and resonate so deeply so many years later. With that brief bit of historical context, we are joined by a scholar, a thinker, an author, Michael Eric Dyson, professor at Georgetown University. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, you've aptly summarized and eloquently articulated the broad sweep of history with a majestic arc, rooted in, first, the acknowledgement that Black suffering in American society has been so deeply entrenched that it is taken for granted. It is the very predicate for American progress. The plantation, then Jim Crow as sharecropping, then separation of society, separation of education, has been the very basis for propelling America forward, white America that is, while Black America is held in captivity. And so the deeply resistive strains of Blackness in this culture that put forth arguments, ideas, and bodies to oppose the vicious and hurtful intensity of white supremacy are seen as exceptions to and not continuations of American democracy. So that Black bodies are alienated from the American scene, Black traditions of resistance are seen as somehow exceptional, and Black life and Black death are seen in a vicious give and take and a cycle trading back and forth. So what we have to do is to acknowledge that this country in which we live has to examine as closely as possible the very roots of its democracy that are intertwined with its own captivity of Black people, but the salvation of America cannot come without the salvation of Black people. What James Baldwin, what Lorraine Hansberry, what Toni Morrison, what Martin Luther King Jr., what Septima Clark understood is that e pluribus unum is more than a credo. It means literally out of many one. And if you have segregated some, if you have isolated others, you cannot have the full health of American society. Look at the pandemic of COVID-19 and look at the pandemic of COVID-16-19. White supremacy, social injustice, economic inequality, joined together to the body. And in both instances, we can't breathe. We can't breathe because of police brutality, and we can't breathe because of a pandemic of COVID-19. This is where the convergence of the natural order and the convergence of our man-made laws have really worked deleteriously to the disadvantage of Black people in this country. Only when we are able to embrace each other across that chasm and tell the truth about the way in which Black death is a fetish. It is the pornography of Black nothingness, of non-being, which is being sought. America is addicted to Black death, and this is part of the problem in American society.
Hey, I'm Ari Melber from MSN.
Yeah. America has an addiction to Black death. I just want us to process that for a moment. Because when we talk about the acknowledgement, we are talking about the ability to acknowledge the root cause and why your statements come across so superficial and so empty and so meaningless to people who have been hurt so badly by this country is because we know that America has had this problem. We know this pain, but a simple statement of we just want to advance diversity and, you know, everyone just getting along does not acknowledge the depth of that pain.
Protests across the county these past 3 days have really opened the discussion of discrimination against people who are Black. But what happens after the crowds stop chanting in the streets? News 8's Steve Price takes a closer look at the phenomenon known as white silence.
It's called white silence, a term for Caucasians who are enraged by police brutality against black residents, but there's no real follow-up, no action to spark long-term change. Protesters of all races over the weekend showing support for our nation's black residents who have long been the victim of discrimination for no other reason than the color of their skin.
We need people that are here for a marathon and not a sprint.
Francine Maxwell, president of the NAACP San Diego branch, says she's seen it before. White residents coming out at the beginning to support equality for all, who then quickly disappear. She says long-term change takes long-term commitment.
Stop standing on the sidelines and being silent. Join one of our 23 committees and let's be about change.
The discrimination has deep roots, illustrated by Amy Cooper's now infamous 911 call to New York City police last month after a black bird watcher asked her to leash her dog.
There's a man, African American, he has a bicycle helmet. He's recording me and threatening me and my dog.
But that incident in Central Park most clearly showed that she understood how the police would operate, right? She had an expectation that saying African American male would trigger something when the police arrived. And that if she knows that, we all know that.
Dale Gore is the outgoing chair of the Department of Ethnic Studies at UCSD. She says there is a lot of work to be done, but it all starts with all of us immediately calling out discrimination because silence can be seen as consent.
What do you do when you see acts of anti-Black violence? Do you say something? When you see vulnerable people under attack, do you use your privilege to sort of blunt that? When you have resources, who do you donate to?
The bottom line, an end to discrimination won't come overnight, so long-term actions show more than short-term words.
My sign says white silence equals white violence, and I want everybody to recognize that because white people are the people oppressing Black people, and that is wrong. 100%.
Francine Maxwell says the local NAACP does have several white residents who are serving in key roles and hopes others will now be inspired to join them. Steve Price, News 8.
So I'm going to ask for us to just take a 30-second moment of silence for white silence. And if you can just take that moment of silence while you read what's on your screen and just process this for a moment. 30 seconds. All right. So all of this to say that as we talk about how do we craft a statement around anti-racism and racial equity, the first lesson in that is that the statement is not what you say, it's who you are, it's what you do and what you say. And more importantly, the one thing that you do not do is you do not remain silent. Okay, so we're going to bury this idea of silence. And a lot of that silence is driven by fear. And I'm challenging white people to get out of your fear, to leverage your skin privilege, and to call out the things that you see that are both overt and covert. So when racism shows up in the subtle details of the way your institution is run and in the way it manifests in conversations behind the scene or policies or practices behind the scene, I'm challenging you as white people to call it out as much as you call out what you see on video when there's a person with a knee on someone's neck for 8 minutes. Just as much as when you see those construction workers in your community who are taking photos mimicking the death of a Black man who was killed in broad daylight for no other reason than the fact that he's a Black man. Call it out. And that rage that you feel when I talk to white people who are upset and are crying and are just angry and like, what can I do? You got to just start by getting out and doing something. But the first thing you can do is speak out and say, this is not okay. And not just to other Black people. Don't just reach out to me and say, hey, Black person, that wasn't okay what these white people did. Go talk to other white people. The piece here that I think is really important, though, is where they say white silence is not neutral ground. What they mean by that is that the idea of race neutrality of, hey, you know, I am going to not engage racism, therefore I'm not a racist, does not make, that doesn't work. Anti-racism is a proactive measure to deconstruct racism, to call it out, examine it, remove it. The lack of acknowledgement of racism, or the acknowledgement without that deconstruction, means that you're just as racist. There's no gray space here, folks. You are either racist or you're anti-racist. Don't be a racist. And don't wait for information to just come out and be manifested in a cell phone picture. Because we're gonna go back to this point about, are you here for window dressing? It comes across disingenuous when your rage only shows up because of what's been caught on a camera. When in fact, racism exists in so many real ways for so long. And we as Black people have been calling this out. We've been talking about racism. We knew George Floyd wasn't new for us. But when we're talking to you about it, you're invalidating the experiences. When we're telling you how it's showing up, and even when you can acknowledge how it shows up through the data, you're still disregarding it. Where is the rage? The rage that you feel now should be the rage that you feel consistently. It has to stay with us, okay? We can't just take it away because we put our cell phones away or the protest stops. And so again, this idea of there is no race neutrality, this idea of just being non-racist, that's enough, is a dead issue. Non-racists practice white silence. We don't want to do that. Racists speak out and do things openly to advance racist systems. So in order to put yourself in a position to make an effective statement, non-verbally and verbally, you need to engage in anti-racism. But anti-racism acknowledges how racism, as I mentioned in the last workshop, shows up in everything. It shows up in housing, criminal justice, public health, education, banking, all of our systems. And it is constantly in existence. It's literally, as I said in the last session, in the water. What's happening in Flint, which still hasn't been resolved, by the way, is a way of looking at how racism shows up in all of our lives. It's literally in the water. It's systemic, it's institutional. And when we see these interpersonal issues between one racist and a person who's a victim, the problem is that racism is backed by institutional and systemic power and authority. And that's why it continues to happen. And so until you call out the systems and institutions that are doing this kind of backing, you're never going to truly be able to fully address some of the interpersonal issues. And then the internalized piece is a whole separate workshop, which we're working on now, just to get to Black people to talk about how we internalize this stuff. But not just Black people, white people internalize it too. And it comes across as racial anxiety. And that racial anxiety that white people feel oftentimes gets them even more silent. It's the fear of making a mistake. It's a fear of being uncomfortable. It's a fear of being called out. It's a fear of not getting it all right. But that idea of everything has to be right and white is a white supremacist concept. Let it go. Be wrong in order to get right. We need everyone's hands on deck for this particular movement. So that's what we call authentic allyship. And here's some things to kind of guide you as you think about, how can I be a more effective ally? This is how you make your statement. Number one, you become educated about racial issues and supporting anti-racism efforts through action. What can I do in my locus of control to help to call out, examine, and deconstruct racist policies and practices in my network and in my locus of control? That's the question you have to ask yourself. When you say, I can't do anything, yes, you can. I can't say anything, yes, you can. This is your statement. You are a living, breathing statement. Listen more than you speak, because as you listen and you learn about what's happening around you, you'll begin to get clarity on the role that you can play in perpetuating real change. Which means that you cannot assume that you know everything, and you cannot get defensive when you don't. I've come across so many white people who want the kumbaya moment. They want the happy ending so badly that they almost talk over what they're learning about how deep this goes to try to get to what Dr. King said, and they try to get to these moments of racial reconciliation without understanding that you've got to sit through the pain. Don't get defensive because Black people are angry with you. You are a representation of white privilege and a collective identity that has been oppressing us. You've got to appreciate that point. And there's a trauma link to that. And it's not about you as an individual as much as it is about the collective power and privilege that you have. Allies also need to apologize when they do something wrong. I don't know how many movements I've worked with where allies have just lacked humility because they're so convinced that they know more than the people that they're in allyship with. What? Acknowledge you're wrong. Center Black people, particularly in this movement, and Black experiences, not your feelings. Not your feelings. I had a conversation about a week or so ago, and someone was really very emotional, and they were saying, I want to know as a white person what I can do. And it was one of many conversations that I had. And I was like, I don't really care what you do. Use your skin privilege. But right now, I can't make this about you because I'm hurting. I'm the victim. I'm carrying the collective trauma of Black people who have for hundreds of years been subjected to all of this racial violence and this racism and these institutionalized practices. I'm hurt. Don't expect me to coddle you right now. White allies know that. But white allies are also responsive, not reactive. So again, that's that play on the words like react, model versus, that's the whole point. Get your attention, right? But we don't want you to just react. We want you to respond. We want you to take some time before you get into the action. Like I just had a conversation this morning about training and how training is the thing that we go to. The first thing we say when we want to fix the racial problem, because of number one, where it says become educated, our first thought is just get everyone trained. Okay, but what are you training them on? In order to have an effective training, you need to have a deeper acknowledgement of what you don't know. So you're going to have to step back and do an assessment. And the assessment will give you a sense. That's being responsive. The assessment is the response in order to identify where the holes and gaps are. So you have a better sense of how you can put together an education program that is responsive to the community that you're in and that can be sustained, not based on a racialized event. Because when you do this in reaction, it comes across as window dressing. I want to offer you white people a resource that you should use. You can Google this. It's the amazing thing about Google. Information is out there. Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility. Why it's so hard for white people to have conversations about race and recognize their whiteness and understand their identity. This is a powerful book that you shouldn't just read once. You should read it 12 times, all right? I'm just throwing a number out. 12 times you should read it, all right? Spend some time with Robin DiAngelo. Immerse yourself in that. Open up conversations in white communities about this book. But she has a really great checklist and a great assessment that helps to ask you the question of whether or not you are truly anti-racist. And I would encourage you to spend time with that checklist. And it's a checklist for white people who say they're anti-racist. And she's adapted that from another document, another resource that she had access to. But I want you to spend time with that. It's an anti-racist checklist for whites, and it's provided by Robin DiAngelo. So the central acknowledgement here is that an anti-racism statement will not solve, like in its verbal form, in its written form, gross inequality and dehumanization that racism has evoked in this country. It's not going to solve it. And so your statement is not designed to be a solution. Your statement is designed to be an acknowledgement of the depth of the problem and an acknowledgement of the depth of how you're going to approach the problem. The path to racial equity is acknowledgement, commitment, and transformation. The statement is an acknowledgement of your acknowledgement. Anything less than that real transformative language is disingenuous, and it will be written off as such. That statement, whether it is written, stated, or in your actions, will affect how your internal as well as your external stakeholders receive your message. and whether they truly believe that you are actually willing to go into a path towards anti-racism. The tone. So we know that silence is not an option, right? But the tone of your message, and we're using the Ben and Jerry statement that has been really popular lately. The ice cream company, Ben and Jerry's, the owners, the leaders of that of Ben and Jerry's, they consider themselves a social change organization. And their statement that they released in reaction to everything that's happening around the country with the civil unrest around George Floyd was hands down the best statement that most of us have come across from any rich multi-million-dollar company of any sort. It was compassionate, it was direct, it was truthful, it was vulnerable. Those components need to be there. The compassion needs to be there. The straight talk for straight understanding needs to be there. The truthfulness of it. Stop dancing around race. Call it out. And of course, in that, acknowledge that you don't know what you don't know, but you're on a pathway to learning. So the do nots that come with this is, we now know, do not remain silent, right? Do not remain silent. This is the time to show, to articulate, to manifest, to demonstrate your real commitment. That's why I said this call is not for folks who are the communications person who just want to wordsmith a great thing and want me to tell you this is the exact word you say. I can't do that for you, but I can tell you what kind of heart you need to transform lives in the way that you say it. The expectation is that you are speaking out against racism and racial violence, and you're not looking for a pat on the back for it. We can't give you a special reward because you wrote a great statement. Acknowledgement is not something that you're going to get a whole lot of credit for. It will make you feel like dirt when you acknowledge the true existence of racism that you've been participating in, that we've all been a part of. But if you're silent on this, it's going to send the message that you don't care, that you're not engaged. The second image, which I know, you're probably like, huh, what does this have to do with some runny eggs? And no, I didn't cook this. Thank you very much. I actually know how to make a fried egg now. And I would never make it with beans and nasty sausage stuff. But the point is, you see how I'm talking about that plate? That's called being hypercritical. Right? And what happens sometimes when we make statements is we can be hypercritical in the statement, so much so that the statement loses its point. So I personally suggest that when you put a statement together, that instead of just openly attacking the things that you feel like you don't align with around this movement, focus on the things you do align with. Focus on the things you do care about. Don't put a whole lot of energy in your statements around rioting and looters. Most of the protests, for example, have been peaceful. So if your energy is put towards addressing and being hypervigilant about calling out the riots and the looting and you're missing the point. You're missing the underlying point about the rage that has come from the pain and trauma of having gone through this lived experience. The disappointment that Black people in this country have faced for hundreds of years. The notion of waiting that has been reinforced to us by well-intentioned, well-meaning white liberals, people who told us there were better ways we could do things years ago. They told us rely on changing on legislation, get a good education, go to school and make something of yourself and it'll change things. Follow the laws, be complicit. We've tried it all. We have a checklist of things that we've done to be in compliance. We even tried silently, peacefully kneeling on a football field, saying nothing more than just getting on our knee, and that was called out as being somehow this atrocity against America. So we have to be mindful that when we're hypercritical of everyone's reactions to this type of pain, that we've missed the point in our statement. So don't be hypercritical. And the last one here, this little image right here, I dare you to try to read the bottom 3-4 rows maybe. And that's what I consider to be vagueness. It's almost like it's a vague statement, right? Like you said a lot of nothing. And we've come across those statements too, where you say a lot of nothing. No specificity, no real sense of your solidarity to Blackness or the Black community, the Black experience, no real understanding of what you need to commit to or do as a white-led organization or as a white ally. Just, this is not right, it needs to stop. Racism is bad, we are one people. That is super vague. Do not practice being vague in your statements. Again, whether your statements are written or it's an actualized thing that you do. So we've talked about tone. We've talked about the do nots. Let's get a little bit into the principles of anti-racism and how this shows up. And I would encourage you to take good notes here. I would encourage you to take some good notes here. So in the principles discussion, right? There's a few things that I want you to acknowledge as principles. Principles establish like your value system. It's the thematic framework around racial equity. It's what you believe in. It's how your values show up, okay? And so one of the principles that I want you to really reinforce to you is you have to want to model a higher ethical code, right? So anti-racism and racial equity is morally, ethically a higher ethical code, morally and ethically a higher code. It is what you aspire toward. The organization needs to say that. It is a solution to your racist corporate dysfunction, to your racist, systemic, corporate, and community dysfunction. We are dysfunctional. The solution is racial equity. The solution lies in acknowledgement and atonement and racial reconciliation. The second principle that matters, and I hope you're grabbing notes because I'm going to run this down to you. This is really important. Marginalized communities, particularly Black people, deserve the right to be heard and validated after hundreds of years of racism. Do not believe for a second that it is okay to silence us right now. The best thing you can do as an ally or as a white-led organization is to create space for the voices that have been silenced for so long. We talk behind the scenes. We tell each other what we really know is going on. We know racism exists. We deal with it every day. Some of us have been living nightmares for 40, 50, 60, 70 years of dealing with racism. And yes, we're resilient, but your resiliency is not a notch on your belt. It's a survival tool to get by so that you and the generations behind you can continue to try to advance through this thing. But one of the things you need to do is create space to make sure that you're lifting the voices of people of color and other Black people, people from marginalized communities rather. The organization also has to commit to translating this aspirational concept of empathy into your policies and your practice. So it's, I feel bad and I'm really hurt and I'm crying and I'm upset and I really want to do something. Okay, then do it. Black lives matter to me. Okay, then show it. How do I show it? Okay, demonstrate it. How do I demonstrate it? Write it down. How do I demonstrate it? Change a policy. How do I do it? Change a practice. What's that practice? Hire a Black person. What's that practice? Pay us more. What's that practice? Listen to us. What's that practice? Shut up. Right? There's a lot of ways that you can show up. There's no one size fits all solution. There's no one way to do this, but it has to be that you take your collective empathy now and you translate it into action. Right? And also as an organization, another principle that matters is that commitment has to be there from the board, from senior leadership, from your directors, from your management to your staff. Everybody has to be bought in. And the commitment has to be to listen to people who have been outside the margins, who have not had traditional position power, who are not the folks that you normally even regard. And you got to ask yourself why you're not regarding them. And you need to get them to the table and listen and shut up. And that's how you exhibit aspirational empathy. You listen, you learn, you begin to connect to their humanity, and you go, okay, so now what can I do within my position of power and privilege to ensure that we atone for the atrocities against people, and that we provide a space where everyone has the ability to thrive? That's what equity is. And then we transform our community. Next, and the final principle is to provide a strategy rather that will help to advance or bring value to Black people and other people of color within your organization. And so, like, principally, you've got to be committed to the strategy work. Principally, you've got to be committed to responsive strategies as opposed to reactive actions, reactive training, reactive transactional moments. Don't be opportunistic and just focus on just this moment. Make it something. I've got organizations that walked away from doing meaningful work are now coming back to the table and saying, we want to do the work now. And this is multiple organizations that have done this, or went quiet when they were approached about doing this work a year ago and are now saying, now we want to do something. And I commend you that you want to be in the fight, but I need you to sustain that. See, like we like to say, keep that same energy. Keep that same energy when the riots stop and it's no longer cute and it's 2 years from now, we don't have a story in the news. Keep that same energy around racial equity and racial justice. Very important. I want to talk a bit about how you translate those principles into strategy. So again, mentioning that you need a strategy, I want you to think of these 5 questions. And again, I'm going to encourage you to write down these questions. They're very important. The first question is, how is your organization using its power to force a new vision of what is right? So what I mean by that is that this is an opportunity for you to open up a conversation about what we can become and what you want to see your community become. Again, the macro. You can talk about what the macro needs to look like. This is the time. It doesn't mean that you're going to make the macro happen alone overnight. You're going to use your collective power and privilege to be able, at the micro level, to accumulate enough energy to shift the macro. Get it? You're going to use your power at the level you're at to shift the larger conversation. That's what's happening now when you see Black communities forming and collectively raging and protesting and standing up and saying enough is enough. It is finally starting to see some progress, but progress is not enough. You keep your knee on our neck, we keep our foot on yours, because the goal is to make sure that we don't let this conversation die like George Floyd did and like all these other people on this list did. So force a new vision of what is right. The second thing you need to ask yourself, right? Recognizing that a statement alone is not going to solve racial inequality. The question I want you to ask is, how does the organization intend to go through a process of acknowledgement, atonement, and action for real change within the institution? That's the question. How is the organization going to acknowledge, atone, and act for real change? And I'm not talking about just reaching out to TPS and saying, hey, can you come in and do a training for us? How are you going to acknowledge, atone, and act for real change within the institution? We'll be there to support you. Andrea Hawkins will be there to support you, leading culture solutions. Karen Hines will be there to support you. Kenya J. Rutling can be there to support you, but you as an organization need to ask yourself, how are we going to acknowledge, atone, and act for real change within the institution, right? The next question would be, how does the organization intend to eliminate barriers to full participation by Black people? I am so tired of hearing organizations talk about what they don't have. You need to figure out a plan to eliminate those barriers. And part of that plan is going back to that slide where I mentioned relationships. Build some relationships. Stop thinking that the access to Black people will come by saying, hey, come into our house. If you open the doors to your home and say, hey, everyone come in, and Black people are walking up the block and going, hell no, I'm not walking in your house, there's a reason for that. It doesn't matter how good the food smells or how nice you look at the door. There's a history there that says that if I come too close to your house, I'm probably not going to make it home. So you got to come out of your space, white people. You've got to come out of your space, and you've got to come into spaces that are occupied by Black people. You've got to allow yourself to be minority, to be minoritized in the moment, and engage Black people in the spaces where Black people are comfortable too, because we got to engage y'all in y'all spaces all the time. Come into our spaces, get to know us, build relationships with us, and begin to bridge and remove the barriers that you've created collectively, and allow for Black people to fully participate. Be intentional. I know some white people are like, listen, I'm trying to hire some Black folk. I'm like, let's go, let's get it. Let's go. Be intentional. Well, is that racist? No, because there's no collective power structure in place that's really operating to sincerely put Black people in positions of power and in privilege. We don't have it. It's called atonement. If you know you've been abusing a system for so long and you've been benefiting from that abuse, atonement means that we're going to rebalance those scales. We've got to offer something radical to rebalance the damage that's been done. The next question I want you to ask yourself is, how does the organization strengthen its accountability to community? So write that one down. How do you strengthen your accountability to the community? What are you going to do to ensure that you are not only just making a statement, but your statement is loaded with an accountability framework, something that says, this is how we are going to ensure you that we're legit. And that's not just a bunch of white people going, yeah, we did great work. Like, no, I mean, like, you're going to go to the people that you serve, your service users, your community representation, the folks around you, independent bodies, and you're going to ask them, are we doing enough? And when they say no, instead of you going, well, geez, what more do you want? You're going to go, thank you for telling us this. Now we're going to step back and do the work of figuring out how we can do more. But that question of how do we strengthen our accountability to community is beautiful. It's a great question. It brings me back to my days of like dealing with results-based accountability, RBA, because RBA makes everyone uncomfortable, because RBA is a premise that's broken into three parts, which the first part is how much do we do? The second part is how well do we do it? But the third piece is anyone better off as a result? And that first question, how much do we do? Most of us live in this world where we are so happy with what we do and how much we do it that we kind of measure our success by that first question. How much have I done? The first question was, how much have I done? Right? The second part of that is, how well do you do it? So that's a quality check. Am I doing this well? Have I done it well? But that third question of, is anyone better off? That's the question that raises a question about accountability. Can people really tell me they're better off as a result of my work? And when I can't say yes to that, then that means I'm doing something wrong, and I've got to go back and I've got to rethink that work that I'm doing. That's how you improve, though. So the organization's accountability to community, particularly the racialized voices and the people that have been oppressed within that system, is so important. And the final question, number 5 on strategies, is, does the organization's racial equity agenda have clear goals, metrics, and targets? So yes, you have an accountability to a community. How are they going to know? What is the picture that you're painting? What are the goals that you hope to achieve? Now understand, again, sometimes white supremacy can teach us that goals need to be fulfilled in a set time, and if they're not, we failed, and if we failed, we should walk away from the project altogether. But I want to challenge you to set goals, fail at some of those goals, recognize your failures, learn from them, come back to the table, set new goals. Those are fundamentals of organizational development, of change management. If you know a change management consultant, shouts to my coach, Andrea Hawkins, shouts to Wendy Helmkamp, who is a racial equity, trained racial equity coach, white woman, phenomenal. I want to stress to you that organizational change coaches will all go through this process with you, where you have to assess and you've got a plan, and then you do a thing, and then you measure the success, and you go back through that cycle. We're just telling you that in the center of that cycle, you need to focus your racial equity work. And you've got to ask these 5 very important strategic questions. I love this t-shirt, y'all. Get you a shirt like this. Get a shirt right now, right on the back of it. If they start shooting, get behind me, Black folk. They're talking about the demonstration of Black Lives Matter. That's a powerful one right there. Okay, the next thing I want to share with you is just some best practices. I know we're coming up on time soon. I want to tell you that I've looked over a lot of statements, and like I said, the ones that have been written. As a communications person, I'm constantly looking for written statements, but I'm also looking at the tone and all these things that I've measured against, principle, strategy, so forth. And I'm gonna give you some best practices. Write these down. Really, really important. Number one is that I've come across a lot of statements. The best ones are when your leadership, particularly white leadership, uses I statements and they personalize the response. So they talk about their framework of understanding it from their lens. And I've come across many that have had Black CEOs that have also written I statements who have been reflective of their experiences, their lived experiences, shared those and talked about why they are committing their companies to taking a certain stance on racism. But when white people are doing it, that's just as important, that you're using I statements and that you're personalizing the response. The other thing that I think is also consistent that we found is that white CEOs particularly have an acknowledgement of their racial identity and their privilege. And I'm not talking about a gloss over, hey, I'm white and I have privilege. I mean, a real articulation of what that privilege is. If you can articulate to me what your privilege is as a white person, that lets me know that you understand the depth of privilege. When you just say to me, well, as a white person of privilege, what in the Sam hell does that mean? I don't know what a white person of privilege means, because you mean you was born. Like, I need to understand like what that means, and I need to know that you know what that means. So make it personal. What is the privilege that you've had in your life? If you truly understand privilege, what is the privilege that you've had in your life, right? The other thing that's come across in a lot of statements is an acknowledgement that Black Lives Matter. That's been stated rather clearly in a number of statements. The denouncement of racism, the expression of zero tolerance policies at organizations have come across as something that has been pretty common in great statements and in great work. The acknowledgement of systemic racism and systemic racial injustice is very important in your statement. I hope you're writing this down. The acknowledgement of racial violence and hatred that has been exhibited towards Black people and that has manifested itself in every major system in our country, that there's an obsession in this country with death, particularly the death of Black people and the justification of that, and that there's a collective outrage to that. That is reasonable, and now's the time to make a change. It's been past time. A statement that acknowledges the names of recent victims of racial violence. They have names, they have personalities, they have lives, they have children. There was another young man that was killed in Atlanta a couple of days ago, shot in the back while running. Police say that he turned around and aimed a taser at them that he took off of one of the officers. They have a deadly weapon. He doesn't. He's running, and the autopsy shows he was shot in the back. So these are all things we need to acknowledge, that there is an obsession with Black death. There are also within your statements, particularly your internal statements, please acknowledge the emotional and safety needs of Black staff. Black people are not okay right now. We have not been okay for a long time, but in this era where mental health is at the forefront of our conversations about humanity, I want to stress to you that Black people are emotionally traumatized. We are hurt. We are fated. And whether it's COVID-19, whether it's this, I mean, everywhere we turn, being Black in America doesn't seem to have a benefit. We have a white, racist, bigot president who does not care about any of the social or emotional violence or harm that he's caused Black people or any other people of marginalized identity in this country. And the reality of it is that we're hurting. And irrespective of the president, for the last 200 years, 400 years, we are constantly hurt. So we want to acknowledge that as well. Your statement should also offer a call to action, which can include everything from resource toolkits, which you can find online, anti-racism resource toolkits, employee resource groups. If you have the resources to even bring in a wellness coach, or reach out to Community Healing Network. The woman over there, her name is Enola Aird, AIRD, phenomenal human being, Black woman, focusing on the emotional emancipation and healing of Black people, and has been doing so long before any of this recent stuff. Reach out to folks like her. But you need employee resource groups, ERGs, that are acknowledging racism and Blackness and the mental and emotional health and needs of the Black employees in your organization. Financial commitments, as I mentioned in the last session, empathy that is not followed by action is not enough. Part of how you empathize is with your dollars. Part of the reason why people are even listening to the Black experience right now is because a lot of money has been lost, and we're making some pretty big waves right now. And when I think back even on the Montgomery bus boycott, we got their attention because we affected their pockets. So if you want to go in the opposite direction, make a financial commitment to Black businesses, white people. Look for Black businesses that sell toothpaste and toothbrushes and laundry detergent, and go to Lowe's instead of Home Depot, and support your Black bookstores, and go to Birkin's Blend Cafe in Glastonbury and in downtown Hartford, so that you can get your coffee, and you can support organizations that are run authentically by Black people that are not radicals. They're just Black and beautiful and trying to build. So put your money where your mouth is and where your passion is. Participate in anti-racism advocacy trainings. Learn how to be an effective advocate. Learn how to be an effective white ally. Then teach other white people how to be allies as well, white people. And then, of course, continue to do the hard work of reading, learning, get articles, books, videos, whatever you can for your personal as well as your professional and your spiritual development as a human being. We have about 5 minutes left. I'm going to invite, we'll take a couple of questions if folks want to put a few questions in the chat box. As we wait for the questions to come in, I just want to put out there that we are available to work with organizations that are sincere and authentic and genuine about doing this work in a meaningful way at Thought Partners. Some consultants will work with you and not assess for how deeply you want to transform. And I would encourage you to decide what kind of consultant you want and to be very discerning. But I will never tell you not to work with other racial equity and diversity, equity, inclusion consultants. You need to find a match for your organization and where you are. But I'll tell you where we're at is we're process oriented, we're transformative, and we're not wasting our time. And there's no amount of dollars that would allow us to subject ourselves to a harmful situation with an organization that's not sincere about transforming, or a board that's not truly committed to wanting to do the work. But if you're a part of an organization that really wants to make that change and is willing to put your resources, your time, your energy, and your heart into action, then reach out to us. You'll find it a lot easier to reach out to Mariana first because she's responsive. I'm not. I have a lot going on and I tend to get back a little bit later. But Mariana is very responsive, and we will set up some time to have a 30-minute consultation with you to get to know more about what you're trying to do. And if we deem it appropriate, we would be happy to work with you and partner with you toward real transformation and change. So I'm looking in the chat box now and just looking over this, trying to see what questions we have. Will you recommend an excellent or some good anti-racism resource toolkits? No, I won't. Go online and do some research and find them. There's lots of good stuff out there. Race Forward has a bunch of stuff. Just go. This is not a matter of evaluating anti-racism resources. This is about evaluating your connection and commitment to going in and learning as much as you can. There are lots of books out there, but they mean different things to different people. Some people love So You Want to Talk About Race. Some people love White Fragility. Some people love Racism Without Racists. Some people need data. Some people need passion. Some people need they need stories. They need anecdotals. What you need will determine what resources work for you. So I would say I'm not going to necessarily recommend an excellent one, but I will say do the research, get to know as many different resources as possible, and then you determine what is working for you and your goals that you've set for yourself and your organization. The webinar is recorded. Is it accessible to the public? In this current form, it is accessible to everyone who is on our is on our purview in our network, and we have a lot of people that have now added themselves into our network, and you can forward it off to people in your network, but it is accessible. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Cindy. Yep, I see Mariana's on it. Strong and to the point. Have you worked with federal agencies? No. And we've worked with, we've been asked to come in and do some work with some state agencies. We are exploring that. We've done some work with some municipalities, but the feds, we have not. And I'm really not invested in working with the federal government. I'm more invested in advancing Black people in community and white people in community who want to make substantive change. Again, micro over macro. How can other ethnic and race allies, many of whom have also been historically marginalized, oppressed, and hunted, support the BLM and rise with the occasions to support our Black brothers and sisters? Martha, I want to say I see your heart on this, and I understand where you're coming from. And I want to encourage you to do the same exact thing that we've told white allies to do. It's not so much the how can, it's the when will you. And the support that you can do is literally the same things that we've mentioned here. Is really invest yourself in understanding the struggle. And I'll say this, Martha, what's really interesting and why this is important that you raise this question is that to be anti-racist is to acknowledge the oppression and the marginalization of all oppressed and marginalized social identities, but it also does not disregard the fact that anti-Black racism is substantively impactful and has really been a defining point for this country. So we can do both. We can have a yes and where we acknowledge anti-Black racism, and we can acknowledge the marginalization and suppression of other groups. And so, Martha, I want you to do the same thing that we're talking about other folks doing, is to begin with that deeper level acknowledgement work your way to a lifelong commitment. And then, at that point, I think it'll be easier for all of us to join and work towards real racial reconciliation. How do you strike balance between leaving white spaces, entering Black spaces, building relationships in those spaces while honoring those spaces and without violating the safety, security, and practices that make those spaces critical and scared for Black people? How do you strike that balance between leaving white spaces, entering Black spaces, building relationships in those spaces? It depends. As a Black person, I'll speak from just solely my perspective. I've learned that I have to unmask when I go into white spaces. I can't mask up anymore. So the same conversations I'm having with Black people, I'm having with white people, and I'm no longer concerned about the safety and security of white people because no one's been concerned about my safety and security. So I'm just not regarding that. I'm focusing on what I know is necessary for the advancement of Black people. I'm going to take the screen share off because I did promise that we would have some live video a little bit here so I can answer your questions without you looking at a screen share. Mariana and I are on here, but that balance, striking that balance is very difficult, Jenna. As a white person, I think it's a matter of also demasking, going into white spaces and being real, and coming into Black spaces and being authentic, and recognizing that in your authenticity that there will be things that you don't know, acknowledging that you're unconsciously incompetent, but saying, I'm still here for your safety and your security, and I'm going to learn. And so in white spaces, you're doing more talking. In spaces of people of color, you got to learn to listen and really begin to respond to the specific needs that folks are talking about, and frankly, the ability to have really empathetic conversations in those spaces. I know we're a little bit over time, but I'm going to honor a couple more questions. The links to the
Jamal, I would just say entering a space with humility. I think that's something that we also, especially when we talk about race, I mean, we are learning from each other and our experiences are valid. Everyone has a perspective. And I think entering a space with humility, and recognizing our humanity in all this is so important. And realizing that we're not always going to say the right things, or we're not always going to be as inclusive all the time, right? Because we're also operating from our own lenses and our own social identity. So I think coming from a space where, I just don't know what I don't know, but also operating and receiving information from others, and also not being too, I would say, sensitive, right? Like, this is work that we're like, doing with each other, and coming from a space where like, oh, that hurt my feelings. Sometimes the truth does hurt people's feelings, but also coming from a space where, dang, that hurts, but I recognize the purpose and understanding behind the true meaning of that statement.
Yep. Thank you. That's real perspective. That's real wisdom right there. Someone also asked the question of the empathetic conversation model. Thought Partners has developed an empathetic conversation model, and we've adapted it from our own resources. I could tell you that the root of it was really rooted in the core foundational relationship therapy techniques that were developed by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Harville Hendricks, who developed something called the Imago dialogue. And the Imago dialogue is fundamentally an empathetic conversation model designed to help couples to be able to get through difficult conversations. And what the empathetic conversation model assumes is that the individuals who are conversing have established some sort of a safety system, that there is an understanding and a vulnerability and an acknowledgement that has happened prior to the discussion happening, and then it allows you to see people's intent versus their impact. But also for those of us who don't understand our impact, it allows us to be able to get a better understanding of our impact by mirroring, which means repeating back what someone says, validating their lived experience, even if we've never necessarily lived it, and then empathizing. As a male, like I could repeat back to say, hey, I hear what you're saying about me too, right? I validate that, we live in a system where the patriarchy is real and I'm a part of it and I suck. As a collective being, I can do more, right? Empathy says, I may not have necessarily been a victim of sexual violence or dealt with discrimination based on my gender or any of that stuff, but you know what? That's gotta hurt, because I've been discriminated against in other ways. And if that's even a small way in which you've had to experience that in your particular stance, I feel you. And as a result of feeling you, I think I can understand better how I can transform my actions to not be a contributor to the patriarchy. Get what I'm saying? And so it's an ongoing thing. It's not an end all be all. It's not a one size fits all. It's constant work, y'all. It's constant work. All right. I want to acknowledge time. We have 4 minutes past. We got a question from E. I got to acknowledge E. How should Black people practice self-care? Yo, that's a whole nother workshop, E. We're going to come for Black people. We're going to help y'all out because we know that Black people have their own stuff with meditation and yoga and just like healing work that we need to do. We're going to come back and do a separate workshop for our people. We're coming for this. Keep pushing, white folk. We see you. We see you. We see you. White allies, white-led organizations, and we'll get back to you the next go round. Thank you for being with us today. We still have 81 people still on the line. We had a little bit over 100 when we started. Thank you so much for being with us today, Madi. Any last words? Close us out.
Thank you. We appreciate each and every one of you, and God bless you, and we'll see you guys soon.
All right, next time.
All right.